you'd be moving from town to
Right.
town teaching English. And again, that was not something I was interested in.
Uh-huh.
So Sarah came to me. She said, well, what? There were some really neat bookstores in Ann Arbor, and there's nothing like that in South Bend as far as
Okay.
something that is eclectic, that appeals to an educated audience and has other things going, because we fell in love with that sort of atmosphere in Ann Arbor. And so I said, well, why not try it?
Why not? Why not try it? Why not open a bookstore in downtown South Bend in the mid-1970s? More on the Griffon Games and Bookstore's almost 50-year journey later, but first, welcome to Round the Bend Now and Then, a podcast that shines a light on the South Bend and Mishawaka area. Through interviews with local business owners, leaders, and community members, our listeners and I learn together about all of the great people and great things going on in our community, as we also learn about South Bend and Mishawaka's history and how intertwined our past is with our present. In our first episode, you heard owner of Peg's Restaurant, Peg Dalton, share her journey in downtown South Bend over the last quarter century. In the second episode, you heard former South Bend Mayor Roger Parent and I discuss his book, but also discuss the drama behind South Bend's urban renewal redevelopment plans that completely demolished the entire block of buildings where Peg's currently stands. In this episode, I meet with Ken Peczkowski to hear he and his late wife Sarah's journey in owning the Griffon Games and Bookstore in downtown South Bend since 1976. It is an amazing journey of a business that has evolved over the years, but at the core, it was a business fueled by their passions and driven by their relationships with their customers. I mentioned buildings being demolished on the block that Peg's is at now. When the Griffon opened in 1976, they were in one of the buildings that was demolished, and that building actually sat exactly where Peg's is at now. You'll hear how difficult and challenging it was to be a new small business owner who wanted to remain in downtown South Bend, but were forced to move not once, but twice because of the city's plans to demolish blocks of buildings to build a shopping mall. However, they persevered and would grow and evolve into what is now the oldest continuously running dedicated game room in the country. So thank you again for listening, and I'm confident that you'll find the Griffon Games and Bookstore's journey in downtown South Bend as intriguing as I did. Before we get into the Griffon's journey, I just wanted to take a heartfelt minute to thank everyone who's listened so far to the first 2 episodes. And obviously, I can see the numbers and how many people have checked the show out, and I must say that I'm quite taken aback. So thank you so much for spending your time listening. And thank you to those folks that took the time to write an email or craft a tweet or a message just telling me what you enjoyed so far about the podcast. That type of feedback definitely helps me plan for future episodes. So thank you all. It truly means the world to me that you're listening. So keep reaching out and keep listening. Before we dive into the journey of the Griffon Games and Bookstore, I wanted to share a story about his grandfather and also a story about his father. You see, they both took a risk, just like Ken and Sarah did in 1976 when they opened up the bookstore. First, Ken shares how his grandfather took that risk and ended up in South Bend, Indiana. I think his story is important to share also because it is very similar to many immigrants and how they ended up in the South Bend, Mishawaka area at the time, looking for work in the varied industries. Here is Ken.
My grandfathers were both recruited from Poland as elderly teenagers by Henry Ford.
Really?
Ford was out looking for cheap labor, and at that time, before World War I, the unions were starting to get a little bit of traction, and I think the car industry, as many other industries, they were looking for places where they could get some exploitable labor who wasn't going to unionize on them anytime soon. Any previously established immigrants that were here in the workforce were, they were becoming a little savvy and starting to get their their act together. So having a bunch of ignorant people come from abroad and who could be exploited, they came, but they made the best of it.
Right. Right.
My grandfather and his older brother were from a family of 5. There were 3 brothers and 2 sisters back in Poland, and they stood to inherit their father's farm.
Okay.
But under the Polish style of handing down the farm was always split evenly among all the sons only. So what was already a small farm was going to be split 3 ways. Yeah. And so my grandfather and his older brother said, nah, we'll just leave it to the younger brother. Let him have the whole farm.
Right.
We're going to take our chances and go to America. And
we're going to take a risk, take a gamble.
Yep, make the big money. So they came and they went to Buffalo first of all places. There was a plant that was there, and they were turned away. They said, "No, we've already filled our quota. Why don't you try Detroit?"
Yeah.
They go to Detroit. Nah, why don't you try this other town that's making making cars also? It's called South Bend, Indiana.
Studebaker.
And so it was Studebaker. So they ended up, although both of them didn't start at Studebaker. The one did, but the other one started over at Singer's.
As a youngster, Ken went to school not far at all from those same Studebaker plants that lured his grandfather to South Bend, at St. Casimir's on the corner of Dunham and Webster. Then in the 1950s, his father took a pretty big risk and headed to Boilermaker country. So you went to St. Casimir's?
St. Casimir's.
And then high school, where'd you go?
Well, St. Casimir's, I was there, but then I was in Lafayette, Indiana for 2 years. My dad, who was a Studebaker worker for 15 years, got tired in the 50s of, I think it was probably 1957. It was a particularly bad winter, and Studebakers laid him off as they had on other previous Christmases. And he got fed up with the idea of that happening, so he decided to take a chance and left Studebakers and sold his house and his car and went to Purdue and got a bachelor's degree in mathematics.
Wow.
And ended up being a school teacher and taught at Adams for from like 1959 till maybe 69.
Adams Eagles.
And then he went to LaSalle. And taught there.
New LaSalle, too.
The new LaSalle, yeah. That time.
At the time.
Yeah.
Soon after moving back to South Bend from West Lafayette, Ken went ever onward to a pretty much brand new Washington high school that was extremely packed with baby boomers. He was the valedictorian of his class, and he attributes that to the top-notch faculty at the time. From Washington High School, Ken went a few miles to the east to the University of Notre Dame. We'll start the Griffin's journey next when Ken shares meeting his wife Sarah at St. Mary's College as he was a student at Notre Dame. And you went to Notre Dame?
Then I went to Notre Dame, yes, 4 years there.
And is that where
graduated magna cum laude, and then I went to. I got a Fulbright grant. I spent a year in Poland. My wife and I, we got married. We met at. I was at Notre Dame. She was at St. Mary's, and one that worked. Many of those Notre Dame St. Mary's marriages don't seem to last long.
Really, I didn't know that. Okay. And met her in college, and you both moved. You got married, and you both went to Poland for your Fulbright?
We went to Poland on our honeymoon. We got married in August and went to Poland a month later in September, which she never forgave me for. She knew a smattering of French, and she had studied classical Greek at St. Mary's, but didn't know a lick of Polish. And I was her only Polish connection.
Oh, my gosh!
So we had quite the year in Poland. It was, and she, I think, actually had a good time after all was said and done.
Yeah, exactly. And probably wouldn't have traded it for the world.
But ours was 48 years. She died 3 years ago from cancer. But it was a fantastic time with her.
Wow.
She was certainly my touchstone and meant everything to me. Yeah. She's quite a gal.
So when you listen to Ken talk throughout this episode, he is not just sharing his journey with the Griffin. It is he and Sarah's journey together. After a year in Poland, Ken continued his education in comparative literature at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. After that, they moved back to good old South Bend, Indiana. Next, Ken shares how the idea of opening a bookstore started.
Sarah fell on her feet because she had gotten her degree in history, but had been smart enough to take a minor in education.
Oh,
so she was able to get a job at St. Joe Grade School.
Yeah.
And she was dealing with kids that were dyslexic. She was at the very beginning of what was considered a new trend, and getting kids that were having trouble reading and discovering that they were dyslexic.
We weren't just we're getting out of just throwing them in a reading group alone in a corner and having them read out loud and be embarrassed and everything.
And be with the slow kids.
Yeah, exactly.
That was totally being redone.
It was
at that
awful.
time.
Okay.
So she was there for 10 years. And so that first year, we lived off of her salary while I said, well, I'm not going to be able to teach. I said, I had a couple of offers from smaller colleges to teach English as an adjunct with absolutely no chance of getting tenure, and it was going to be like being in the military. Teach at a place for 4 years, and then they let you go, and you'd be moving from town to town teaching English. And again, that was not something I was interested in. So Sarah came to me. She said, "Well, what? There were some really neat bookstores in Ann Arbor, and there's nothing like that in South Bend as far as something that is eclectic, that appeals to an educated audience and has other things going, because we fell in love with that sort of atmosphere in Ann Arbor. And so I said, well, why not try it?"
Next, you'll hear how Ken went from the most overqualified cook to a small business owner in downtown South Bend, Indiana.
Went to the banks at that time, and they laughed. They said, "You have no experience. You have no business degree. You're comparative literature. Come on, nah, we're not going to take a chance on you." I said, "Well, what will it take?" They said, "Well, if you have some earnest money." So I took a job for a year as a short order cook at a pancake house in Roseland. And I worked there for 1 full year. In fact, when I hired on, I told the guy who hired me, I says, "I'm doing this for 1 year." I said, I'm being right up front with you because I'm saving this money for that. We're living off my wife's income. And he said, "Okay." He says, if you guarantee me that you're going to be here a year, he says, "You've got the job." He says, because he says, "You're the most overqualified cook."
I'm sure you were. I'm sure you were. So you worked there for a year and saved the money, and then
saved the money, and then I started buying up inventory because I knew we were going to deal in secondhand books.
Okay.
So I was just on my weekends and free time, I was going to garage sales and every place else that I could, and we had a 2-bedroom apartment in the Crestwood Apartments at that time.
Okay.
And so in that second bedroom, that's where I was just amassing, and by the time we were ready after a year, that room was filled from floor to ceiling with books.
Oh, man.
That I had ready to go for an inventory.
It smells like a library.
Yes. Yep. Went back to the bank, and this time the banks were passing me around. At that time, it was St. Joe Bank. St. Joe Bank said, "Well, if you locate at Scottsdale Mall," which was new then. And we have invested heavily in it. St. Joe Bank was one of the big financial backers of Scottsdale. They said, we'll put you there. And I said, "I don't think I want to be in a mall." I said, "I want to be downtown." I said, it's centrally located.
Okay.
I said, "It's still got good foot traffic." I said,
that was one of my questions. Like, why?
And the rent compared to a mall was reasonable.
Okay.
And I said, I'd like to take my chances down there. And so St. Joe Bank says, "Well, if you're not going to Scottsdale Mall, find somebody else." So I went to, it was National Bank, said the same thing, that they weren't interested. It wasn't until I got to First Bank, which eventually becomes First Source Bank. But First Bank at that time said, "Okay, if you can come up with a little extra collateral, we'll give you a loan."
Luckily, Sarah had some stock in Kodak that Ken said wasn't really even doing well, but it worked for collateral. So, the Griffon Bookstore was born. I also found it real interesting about St. Joseph Bank. He said they had a large stake in the new Scottsdale Mall. At that time, the mall was only a few years old and was one of the reasons that businesses and shoppers were leaving downtown South Bend. He said they would work with him only if he opened up the store there. I never even really thought of that angle, and that just adds to the litany of things that were pulling shoppers and businesses out of downtown and to the malls. And as you'll hear, the first few years was a bit tumultuous, as the Griffon would spend those years directly dealing with the exact same urban renewal redevelopment plans that Mayor Parent and I discussed in our last episode. And it was so cool for me to hear about that era from one of the elected officials' perspective, and then a week later, hearing it from the side of a small business owner. Next, we talk about the first ever Griffon Bookstore on Michigan Street, which again, as I shared in the last episode, that little area of Michigan Street looked nothing like it looks like now, as every building on that entire block ended up getting demolished as a part of their plans to build the mall there. And as you'll hear, his store was literally where Peg's restaurant is at now. As you'll also hear, the first Griffon was originally an alley that got renovated into an inside space by putting a roof over it and building a floor. Your first location was at 121A South Michigan, and it was 13 feet by 120 feet, and the first store was an alley until a roof and a floor got put in. Am I right?
Right. That was done by office engineers.
And was it currently where the TCU parking lot is at, or was it more towards like where like the Beacon Health building is?
The Beacon Health building, in fact,
okay.
where
Peg's is at, or somewhat.
Right, where Peg's is at.
Okay,
exactly.
So that's
just about the middle of that block is where the original that alley was, because it divided that block in half.
Okay,
and so our neighbors on either side, we had on one side what had been. It was a men's clothing store. And on the other side of us was a shoe store. Uh-huh. That block was full. I mean, there was full tenancy in that block. And across the street, there was Osco's had their drugstore, and there was office engineers and business systems. The two big office supply stores were both downtown
right there
at that time. And that alley was one that office engineers had filled that alley in order to sell carpeting. They were doing business carpeting because it was long so
and
they
narrow.
Had these long rolls of carpeting were in the storehouse. So when we looked at it, I looked at it and I said, well, okay. It was divided in half because where they actually had a huge overhead door on the back that was in the alley that was behind that building. And in that overhead door, their trucks would come in and pick up the rolls of carpeting. And so they were able to drive in. So when we looked at it, I said, well, okay, we've got a built-in parking place for my car. So I didn't have to worry about having to park downtown. And so I said, okay, but this area where they were doing the carpets, there was a wall there, and they had what was a pretty crummy looking bathroom.
Okay.
So one of the first things we did was, okay, we're going to open the bookstore. We'll use the front end for the bookstore, but what to use from that wall all the way back to where the car was parked, because there was another wall there. And we had been warned by the American Booksellers Association. We joined because we figured, well, we might as well be in a professional organization to begin with.
To learn from, to grow from, and
to see what advice they would give us. And by and large, it wasn't a good deal, except for the one bit of advice that they did give us, which said, don't hang your hat on books. Make sure you have a good sideline. And we thought about it for quite a while as to what a good sideline would be, and that's when we decided on games. Yeah.
And as you'll hear next, that advice of not just hanging your hat on selling books will probably be some of the most important advice that they received.
It was while I was in New York that I went to a chess studio, and it was a place where they sold chess books and chess sets, but they had right in front of where they were selling their chess sets, like 6 chess tables on the floor, and people were playing. And I go, why not do that for other games?
Right. Yes.
And not just chess. So I said, that's what we're going to do with that back area. So we opened that up, and it is now the oldest continually running dedicated game space.
Wow.
In the United States.
Wow.
Yeah, there is no place that's older than ours in that. And we're now actually the oldest independently operated single location
really
game and bookstore in the United States. The only one that was older went out of business 3 years ago because of COVID.
Wow. That's a true testament. I mean, that is a true testament right there. Wow, that's amazing. How cool is that Ken and Sarah opened the Griffon in a building that used to be an alley, and now 47 years later, they're the oldest continuously dedicated game space in the United States. That's just proof of the dedication and passion that Sarah and Ken have had over the years. As you probably know by now, I learn a lot about our area's past through our old newspaper articles, and anything else I can get my hands on that describes our local history. In the last episode, I shared how I stumbled upon a binder at the library that contained a series of newsletters called the Downtown South Bend Council City Center News, and the main intent was to hype up and pump up downtown area to keep businesses and people shopping there. Next, I share one of the articles that I found from 1978. And if you ask me and others who were born that year, it was a great year. I found an article from August of 1978, so you'd only been open for a couple of years.
2 years, right.
And it is, the Griffon Bookstore gambled on downtown South Bend and won. And the first sentence was, the success of Griffon Bookstore shows that a willingness to gamble on downtown South Bend pays off. Now, that early, I mean, did you know that?
Not a clue. That was, as they call it, that was hype.
Yes. A brief word from one of our sponsors. I want to thank Augie's Locker Room for sponsoring this episode. If you've never been to Augie's, let me tell you. Augie's Locker Room is a Notre Dame sports memorabilia and gift shop. And folks, the words memorabilia and gift shop really don't sum up the place. You walk into Augie's, and it is literally like a Notre Dame sports museum. From leather helmets to autographed footballs, championship rings, game-worn cleats and gear, and even my favorite football player ever, Joe Montana's jersey. Augie's Locker Room is located a quarter mile from Notre Dame at 1811 South Bend Avenue. If you're familiar with Studebagels or Tap House on the Edge restaurant, it's right in that same plaza. I highly recommend that you stop by Augie's Locker Room. If you have a loved one in your life that's a Notre Dame fan, stop by and find that perfect original gift for them. If you're a Notre Dame fan, stop by Augie's and buy that perfect gift for yourself. You deserve it. And at the same time that you're shopping and looking at all the historical memorabilia, you might learn something you didn't know about Notre Dame sports history from Jim, the owner. He's a great dude, very knowledgeable, and most importantly, passionate about Notre Dame and the South Bend and Mishawaka area. Again, check out Augie's Locker Room at 1811 South Bend Avenue. Their phone number, get this, 574-277-NDND. So 574-277-6363. Check them out at their website, augieslockerroom.com, and I also put that link into the show notes so you can check them out there. Or you can find them on Facebook, Augie's Locker Room. Now, back to the episode. As I hope you know now, one of the things that I want to do on this podcast is to share stories that weave together our area's past and our present because they're just so interrelated with each other. The underlying historical theme of the first few episodes have been that urban renewal redevelopment project around the 100 block of South Michigan Street, including the ill-fated Century Mall project, the inside shopping mall planned to hook businesses and shoppers back from Town and Country Shopping Center, and the aforementioned Scottsdale Mall and soon-to-open University Park Mall. We spend the next 10 or 15 minutes hearing the story behind the Griffon Bookstore and those redevelopment projects. all of this gave me such a sense of what that entire era was like from a people perspective. Here we have a husband and wife together, opened a business that they were extremely passionate about, and wanted that business to stay in the heart of downtown South Bend. This is something to me that should be a no-brainer for the city to want to help out. Well, as you'll hear, nothing was easy to keep the Griffon Games and Bookstore in downtown South Bend. Next, as we talked about earlier, their first store at 121A South Michigan Street was literally in the eye of the urban renewal redevelopment storm. And for even a seasoned business owner, it would have been a tough situation. But for brand new business owners who just started, it had to have been extremely scary. And as you'll hear, it didn't take long for Ken and Sarah to feel the effects of it all. They had to learn to run a small business and at the exact same time deal with all the drama swirling in real time over the redevelopment plans. But just, even early on, opening the bookstore was a gamble.
It was a gamble, yes.
Where your block was at, there was all the talk of urban renewal and redeveloping downtown, and this developer has this idea, that developer has this idea, and so, but you were a new small business owner. I mean, just trying to get your footing, I'd assume, just about running a business, but you had kind of to deal with all that too. Is that right?
Yes. It didn't take long. We were in our location probably not even a year when office engineers warned us that things were going to be changing.
Is that who you paid rent to?
That's who we were paying rent to.
That's who owned the
building still at that time.
Okay.
Carl King, who had been the founder of the place, passed away at that time, and the business went to his son-in-law, who I don't know but for whatever reason, they were not doing well, and they could see the writing on the wall, so they started closing down their operations, and they gave me a heads up saying, "Look, we're not going to be your landlord anymore. We're not sure who is going to be." Whether it's going to be some bank, because there were 3 banks that were all vying for office engineers' properties at that time.
Okay.
I don't remember who they were, but they said it looked like a bank is eventually going to be your landlord, and you can probably expect your rent to change. And so I said, that being the case, and that was the first lesson I learned. I said, I want to buy the place.
Yeah.
I said, I want to be the owner. I want to not have to be at the whim of whatever landlord is going to come and say, look, we're raising your rent. Your lease is up. And, we didn't get the chance to do that. A bank did pick it up.
Okay.
They kept it because they had been alerted by the Department of Redevelopment of the city of South Bend that the R66 project was going to go through. And R66 was the urban renewal project that the federal government had given them a grant and a number for, so that they could relocate the businesses that were going to be in what was going to be that target center of downtown South Bend. They sort of piddled away at it for 2 years. I mean, we were in that location from 1976 until 1981. So we were there almost 5 years, during which time Sears left, Penny's left, Robertson's went under. Almost all the big to medium-sized businesses had left. And South Bend, at that time, the Redevelopment Commission was hanging their hat on what they called the anchor concept, that you need to have an anchor store in order to make sure that a shopping area is viable. And so they were trying their best to keep one of the big department stores there. But when they all left, it ended up being Osco's was the heavy hitter that was left in that area.
And if anybody knows the South Bend Chocolate Factory right now, that was Osco's, correct?
Correct.
Yep.
And our second store.
Next, we talk about the Griffon having to relocate because the buildings on their block of Michigan Street were being demolished. Nothing was easy. And if it were up to the city, customers of the Griffon could play Dungeons and Dragons until midnight and then head next door and throw $1 or $2 on stage. and not at the Morris. You had to move out of that, right? Talk to me.
Right. So everybody who was in that block and that was Michigan Street as it was bounded on the south side by Jefferson and on the north side by Washington Street. And then everything from Michigan Street to Maine. All the stores in there. So there was the Bull Jeff, there was the Jefferson Street bookstore, there was Fox Jewelers, there was I don't know if it was Milady Shop. There were two dress stores. There was the Lerner Shop, and then there was Business Systems, and then across the street there were a couple of businesses. There was Toby's, which didn't last long. It was a sort of a gift shop, and then Osco's, of course, was across the street. And then there was a Christian bookstore that was between Osco's and the Sherlin building?
Yeah, Sherlin building.
And then the Sherlin building, where there's several businesses now. So all the businesses were given their eviction notices by the city of South Bend, saying we intend to demolish, and because we are required by the federal government, we are going to make an effort to find you an alternate location.
So, air quotes, possibly.
so the effort was that. First of all, they offered the Jefferson bookstore, which was just around the corner from us on Jefferson. They were a family-run bookstore and had been there for much, much longer than we had. And the city offered them a place on South Michigan Street next to the Torch Lounge.
Oh, heck no.
So right next to a topless bar, they wanted to set up a family bookstore. So the Jefferson bookstore said, no thanks, we'll go out of business. And so they said, if that's the best you can do, we're out of here.
Absolutely.
And so then the city offered us the location. And I said the same thing. I said, I'm not interested. I said, however, I'd like to see what's going on. And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, is this the only thing you can offer me? And said, well, you can look for yourself. See if you can find a place that you're interested in.
Right.
I said, but what do I do in the meantime? And they said, well, that's up to you.
Right. Imagine that. You've only been in business for a few years and your building is already being demolished. You want to stay in downtown, but they offer to relocate you next to a strip club. And then it's up to you to find a new spot. But it gets even more interesting from here. With a little help from family and a whole lot of self-directed learning for Ken and Sarah, they learn that there are a few more options for the businesses being affected than the city is letting on.
So, fortunately enough, my wife's brother worked in Washington, D.C. As a lawyer for the Commerce Department.
Ooh.
And Sarah, my wife, contacted him, and he said, I'm going to send you the booklet on this R66 package.
Ooh.
Read it.
Educate yourself.
So I did, and I read this thick manual, and it told me that in lieu of our finding a place, that the city was responsible for us having access to the buildings across the street that were included in the R66 project. What they didn't tell us was that Osco's, the Christian bookstore, that where Chocolate Factory is now, all those buildings were part of the R66.
They were slated to get demolished.
And the people had moved out, but it wasn't going to be demolished as quickly as the other side of the street. So they had, the city of South Bend had temporarily rented that Christian bookstore to a woman who had connections with the city of South Bend, and she was subleasing it to an Asian restaurant organization, and she was making a killing because she was paying like $200 a month rent.
She was flipping it and making a profit.
She had a hot dog stand in the front, and she was renting the back of the place for $700 a month to another person. So I looked at this and I said, all right, she is not part of the original project. What the language said in this book that I got from my brother-in-law said that only people who were originally part of the project are allowed to stay in that location. So I went to the city and I said, look, I'm interested in that location while I'm looking for another place.
Right.
Why can't I have that? And after a lot of humming and hawing and a lot of bureaucracy, they finally admitted, you're right. You're the only person who has stayed out of everybody that was in your block. You're the only one who says they want to stay in downtown South Bend. It's yours.
In summary, Ken discovered through that R66 redevelopment manual that the city had to offer him access to other buildings that were also included in the project. He could be temporarily relocated to the other buildings that were already slated to be demolished in the future. And one of those buildings that was slated to be demolished was the building that housed longtime business Osco Drugs and now the South Bend Chocolate Factory, where the Griffin's second home was at least for a few years. And this is just another example of how our past is connected to our present. Imagine if the South Bend Chocolate Factory building would have been demolished like it originally was slated to be. That business now is a mainstay in our downtown. Ken kept talking about going back and forth with the city, and my totally basic brain goes to, like, how? I mean, how do you actually go back and forth with the city? And his answer is just one more example of why the business that he and Sarah built has been so well loved over the last almost 50 years. Customers dedicated to them. Do you have to go to official meetings, or did you just have to go to the...
I had to, fortunately, at that time, among our customers who were very much into strategy games were 3 lawyers.
Oh, perfect.
And it was the offices of Parker, Bruner, and Hamilton.
That's perfect.
And both Tom Bruner and John Hamilton were gamers, and they went to bat for us. Gratis, essentially.
Yeah.
It was a pro bono thing on their part, and but we eventually used them as our lawyers from that point on.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
But they went to the city and said, "Look, you're in violation here. You need to allow this bookstore to go in to that location." So we moved into that Christian bookstore location.
Okay.
And we were there from 1981 to 1983. In 81, I started looking for an alternate location.
Okay.
I asked the city if I could buy the location that I was going to. I said, I'd like to buy this location. And they said, nope, not available. It's part of R66. We're going to be demolished.
The location that you were in, your second store you wanted to buy. Our second store. Okay. And it's still at that time they were saying that's on our list of buildings
on
to
our
raise.
list to be demolished.
Okay.
Correct.
Now don't forget that this is all within 5 years of them opening their business. They couldn't just focus on learning the ropes of their business. They had to deal with the possibility of not having a business. Since the second building they were in was also slated to be demolished, Ken and Sarah had to find a more permanent location, which would be their third and thankfully final location. Here is Ken describing their purchase of the Colfax Avenue building and how it was definitely not move-in ready.
121 West Colfax. It was part of the Sonneborn Sporting Good Complex.
Okay.
They owned all of the buildings from the corner of Main all the way to the alley that went right behind the Palais Royal and the Morris Civic Auditorium.
Okay.
So they had what is now the LaSalle Grill restaurant, our building, and the Waterworks were all owned by Sonneborns at that time. And Charles Sonneborn Sr., who was still alive at that time, he was the one who showed me the building and had given me a little heads up on the history of the building. It was very dingy looking, and the building was obviously in a lot of state of disrepair.
In disrepair, yeah.
And but I was able to, again, get enough interest, and the building itself had some collateral in it.
Okay.
We ended up buying the building for, I think it was a ridiculously small sum at that time.
Right.
I think it was like $30,000.
Wow.
Bought the building.
But, in the early 80s.
But it took $75,000 to bring it up to code.
Oh, just to code?
Just to code.
Lord. Next, you'll hear more of the trials and tribulations of having to relocate and renovate, all because of the city's yet-to-develop redevelopment plans. You just heard him say that it took $75,000 just to bring it up to code. But thankfully, you'll hear that the city was responsible for half of the renovation bill. And once again, the dedicated lawyer gamers went to bat for the Griffin.
Fortunately, the city was responsible for half of that bill.
Oh, and
because they could not move us from a place that had passed code to a place that didn't pass code.
Okay.
And again, our lawyers went to bat for us.
Yes.
And they said, look, you're sending them to it. They've got a place. They're going to buy it. They're going to be a downtown.
You're darn
merchant.
Right. You should do all you can to keep them.
And the federal government is giving you this money to make sure that this transition, that you're not putting small businesses out of business.
Yes.
So they, again, reluctantly, the city, and they fought us tooth and nail all the way. I had to become the general contractor, and I had to hire all the subcontractors to do the work, and that was just a mess. I had no business. I didn't know what it was to be a contractor.
No. And no internet. You can't look up anything. It's just it's.
And it was interesting, the people that we hired and how that panned out.
Uh-huh.
The general contractor that we hired was an organization called Aardvark Construction.
Okay.
And Aardvark Construction, after a couple of years, after they had done the work for us, were involved in a huge scandal. They were using their business as a front for the illegal importing of antiques from abroad.
Oh my gosh!
And there was the head of the organization. I forget his last name. His first name was Tom. He wrote a book about his experiences of running the Aardvark Construction Company and how he was just a brash criminal. He knew what he was doing. He was importing drugs and
intentionally,
explicitly. And was doing this as a front, and the city helped me hire him because they made me the contractor, and they went for the low bid because I took 3 bids from 3 contractors as I thought I should do, and so I accepted his, and then it ended up being that they were a criminal organization.
That's crazy. But
they did good work.
Hey. And it's still there. And it's still standing.
It is still there. They put in some great staircases.
That's amazing. That's truly amazing. Yep. Ken was not lying there. I looked up Aardvark Construction, and I'm sure that an entire episode could be done on that alone. Wow. An article from August 8th, 1991 detailed owner Tom Hickey's sentencing of 20 years in prison. Turns out, Hickey was a fugitive for 5 years on the run and was arrested after being featured on the television show Unsolved Mysteries. A lot of the younger listeners out there probably have no clue, being all scared up at night listening to Robert Stack and that creepy old music. Anyway, Tom Hickey and his partner were arrested for running a drug ring that sold 100,000 pounds of marijuana from 1979 until 1986. And those were the same exact years that they were renovating the Griffon. Whew. It says, quote, although most of Hickey's income came from the marijuana smuggling business, most of his time was spent working for Aardvark Construction, the construction company that he and his partner set up as a front for the drug smuggling. End quote. That's wild. But they did good work. Next, I asked him what Ken now would tell the Ken in the newspaper from 1976. He shared that owning the building is what saved them. He shared how impacted the Griffon was financially by all of the forced moves by the city. When you look at an old picture of you guys back in 1976 or whatever, what would you now tell Ken back then?
Make sure that you buy that store. That has absolutely been the saving grace for us. If we hadn't bought the store that we are in, I am sure that we would have been out of business.
Yeah.
That if we had been at the mercies of having to move time after time, just the move that we did make when we moved from that second location when we were next to Osco's and the city moved us out. That's a story in and of itself, how the city moved us out of there under false pretenses and didn't demolish the building behind us. But when we moved into the one on Colfax, the rent at that time was, I think it was $10 a square foot was sort of the average for a place downtown at that time for a Class B. I mean, that wasn't even Class A rental, but retail didn't really need Class A the way offices did or not. And if we hadn't picked that up, I'm sure we would have been just buffeted around. Because the move that we made from the place on Michigan Street to that one, we moved there in 1983. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until 1989. It was 6 years later that we were making as much money in that location as we were in the previous one. We lost 6 years of income to recover, and then from 1989 on, we started building up from that again.
You couldn't have survived another move here and there. I mean, that's...
Moving across the street was surprising. I mean, we lost customers who couldn't even... We had put signs and said, we're moving across the street. And there were people who go, oh, the place is demolished, you're gone. And they didn't think to just turn around and look.
That's huge. And again, you're at the mercy of the city and everything, but just owning it has helped you over the years too, and you can be flexible over the years also. And
correct.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what,
And the other thing I would have told myself, looking at that picture of me that they took in 1976, bell bottoms may have a future. I was wearing bell bottoms then.
Bell bottoms will come back around every 20 years.
Right.
That's
Don't throw them away.
Yeah, don't throw them away. That's exactly right. That's funny. It's just so wild that all of those moves set them back 6 years. That pretty much wraps up our talk about all of the drama behind having to move 2 different times because of the city's redevelopment plans. But to this day, the Griffon Games and Bookstore is still at 121 West Colfax Avenue. And from this location, Ken and Sarah have formed relationships with literally generations of customers through word of mouth and very limited advertising. Ken talks about that next. Let's talk about your customers over the years. People who came in back when you guys opened, I mean, you could be serving their grandchildren by now.
Great-grandchildren.
Great-grandchildren.
We even have a couple of great-grandchildren from our original customers.
Amazing. Early on, what types of customers? Younger, older, high school, college, or just all types? Or
so our first customers tended to be from late high school age up to their 30s. So we had a sort of a demographic that we were locked into those early years. People were finding us. The amount of foot traffic that was starting to come to South Bend was less and less. Those days of the crowded sidewalks, of everybody walking everywhere from Gilbert's
holding big shopping bags, walking down with their nice hats on.
Exactly, all the way up to the LaSalle Hotel. That was gone, and the street traffic, because of the city hemming and hawing and deciding, are we going to do a downtown mall? Are we going to make it a shopping center? Mm-hmm. They changed the traffic pattern. They closed off Michigan Street eventually. And
River Bend Plaza.
Oh yes, River Bend Plaza. That was another one of the nails in the coffin that sent a lot of people running.
Yeah.
No, we made it through that as well, and we kept on just plucking away at the idea that we're going to be a destination.
Yes.
That if we get ourselves known, we did not have an advertising budget. We did a little bit of advertising through the high school newspapers, the yearbooks. We did that for a couple of years. It didn't seem to bring anything, though.
Right.
The word of mouth was doing it, and we said, okay, it was a model that worked for Hershey chocolates back in the day. Hershey's never took ads out until much later.
So they got huge. Wow.
And so we said, we'll do word of mouth. So we produced a series of bookmarks that had our name on it, and we gave it to every customer we had. And those bookmarks, that even from our first store,
are they still floating out there here and there?
Every once in a while, I'll take a book in trade today.
Yeah.
And I'll look at that. There's one of our bookmarks from 1979.
That's neat. I like that. Speaking of customers, the Griffon has inspired several writers to become published authors. Next, I asked Ken about one of them. When I first started planning this podcast, I asked on Twitter for any episode ideas, and somebody suggested that I talk to Ken to hear the Griffon's journey. Turns out, that somebody was somebody that knows Ken and Sarah very well. My Twitter account is roundthebend574, and I got a couple thousand followers on there. And matter of fact, that's how, I put something out there. A gal, Kat Rambo.
Yes.
She said, "Hey, you need to talk to Ken."
Yes.
So I don't know her from anybody. Just on Twitter.
She's been with us. We met her, I think she was still in grade school then. Her mother worked as a writer for the South Bend Tribune.
Okay.
Her mother was Deanna Francis. Her daughter, Kat, who was Catherine Francis at that time, now is married Kat Rambo. She found us when her mother happened to be doing the beat in downtown South Bend and wrote a story about us and brought her along with her. And so Catherine was our first employee other than me and my wife. We hired her. She went to St. Joe High School, and my wife was very interested in having the feminine touch in what was otherwise a geeky male-dominated area. And so we hired her while she was in high school. So she worked for us at our store.
That's cool.
She eventually went on to Johns Hopkins and is now a very well published writer.
Yeah.
She was the president. She was president for a couple of years of the Science Fiction Writers Association of America.
That's cool.
Right, and she's one of four writers that have come out of the Griffon who have gone on to do things in fantasy or science fiction.
That's beautiful. I mean, that's beautiful. How many fantasy writers have come out of Barnes and Noble? Zero. But they have a connection with you, and man, that is so neat. So thank you, Kat, for suggesting that I talk to Ken and share the Griffon's journey. Over almost 5 decades owning a business, you amass quite a collection of memories and rewarding experiences. But most importantly, you amass quite the relationship with customers. Next, Ken shares how important that is, and he shares why grandparents and grandchildren get along so well, because they have common enemies and a common love of the Griffon Games and Bookstore. You're almost 50 years,
47 years.
47 years.
Right.
I know it's hard to sum it up, but man, what are some of the more rewarding things of your life's work?
Absolutely the customer base and the loyalty that has been there. It's a funny thing that companies always say they pride themselves on customer loyalty, and to me that's a two-edged sword in the hands of these big retailers. For them, customer loyalty is nothing more than what they can bribe that customer to keep coming back to their store in the way of sales or of promotions or of something else.
Right.
But as far as having an integrated role in the life of that customer, all they're looking for is just,
an exchange.
Use our credit card and we'll give you some points, and as long as you stay a loyal customer, which means use your credit card with us, you're in good standing. But do we know your name? Do we know your kid's name? Do we know your pet's name? Have you any kind of track record with the people that are our employees? No, you go to one of these big box stores and there's somebody new selling the merchandise every month. They're lucky if there's a guy that's been there working 2 years straight that you even get to know their name.
Right.
No, the customers that we had, in fact, just this past year again, this Christmas season, I had people who had moved from South Bend, had gone to Seattle or to Montana or to Florida or someplace else, came back and they came into the store and they said, "You're still here. This is wonderful."
Oh God, I got goosebumps.
And they had their grandkids with them, and they would say, "This is where I used to come." And the kids were their big eyes, and they're saying, "Grandpa, did you play Dungeons and Dragons?" And he says, "Yes, I was at the beginning."
That is neat.
And it's interesting how many of the games sort of skip a generation. That first generation of people that we had, their kids, it's funny how the kids sort of rebel against the parents.
Yeah.
What my parents thought was cool, that's not cool.
Cool.
No, it's got to be something different.
Right.
But the grandkids having this rapport with their grandparents saying, Grandpa, what did you do as a kid?
Yeah.
And because Grandpa's not invested with the kid the same way that their parents
Of course.
are. So he can get away with spoiling them, doing all sorts of stuff. And then he can be very nostalgic, bring up all the stories of things that he told. Because as a grandfather, but having your grandkids listen to you with that, big eyes and just wondering, that's just great. And we have that just going on all the time.
That is so cool. I mean, that is seriously cool. That is, like you said, you can't get that from Barnes and Nobles and, from the big box stores. You just can't.
No.
That is so cool.
No. Nor can you get it over the internet.
When I was planning this episode, I knew I was going to share the Griffin's journey, so I just put it out there on the @RoundTheBend574 Twitter account. I just asked some followers if you are now or ever have been a customer, just drop me a line or two of what the Griffin has meant to you over the years. And so next, I share a few of those with Ken. And after listening to that, I don't even need to tell you how important the Griffin has been in our community and to people in our community's lives. I have no clue who these people are. It's Twitter, half of them at, not their real names or anything, but I used to ride my bike there from Clay Township back in the 80s, bought tons of books and figurines there. Good times. Somebody else, I wrote my senior thesis at Notre Dame on the TTRPG/gaming culture. Ken and Sarah were instrumental. And somebody else mentioned that they were homeschooled and their mom would I never even thought of that either, but their mom would bring them in there and they thought it was the neatest thing.
A lot of homeschooling people came to us, yes.
I mean, they said it had creaky, wooden floors and the bookstore smell and you kind of felt like you're in somebody's house. What else here? And then the Griffin was and still is a sanctuary for all the smart, geeky kids who didn't quite fit in at school. It's been a major force for good in the world.
That was our sort of our mission in itself, and I think Sarah would be in the forefront of that. She was always a proponent of us doing something that would be a haven for kids who were otherwise not being treated well. She was seeing this as a teacher at St. Joe Grade School.
Beautiful.
Kids who had been, looked down upon or who had been bullied. I mean, bullied wasn't even a term then.
But they were still bullied.
They were bullied by their peers because they couldn't read well, they couldn't do this. And to have a safe place that they could come to where they would be understood, where they could compete on an even footing with someone else and learn those reading skills while playing a game. That's sort of how the Dungeons and Dragons phenomenon sort of took off for us.
Okay.
And how several other industries, in fact, we had several child psychiatrists come to us over the years who said that they discovered that using role-playing as a therapeutic feature, that kids who would come to them who were being battered or mistreated either by their parents or grandparents or whoever or some relative, that the kids would just clam up, but put them in an atmosphere where they think they're playing a game.
Right.
And in Dungeons and Dragons, you're taking on the role of someone else. So it's easy to do this sort of thing where, okay, your character is this hero. If you could do anything you want, the therapist is saying to the child, what would you do? And the kid starts to open up and saying, and then all of a sudden the problems that the therapist sees that the child is facing become evident through a game.
Yeah.
And it was things like that
so awesome.
that made us think that, okay, this is the right thing.
Right.
And then the number of battered kids that we knew who came to us. We had several examples of children we knew who were being abused at home. They would come to us with bruises, broken arms, and they were afraid to go home. And so our game room, which was open until midnight on the weekends, they would come and they would stay till then. And I remember a couple of occasions where I had one where the drunken father came at midnight and said, I'm here for my son. And I told him to go away, that I would be taking him home that evening because I saw that his dad was so drunk that he was in no shape to do anything good.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Wow. A bookstore.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, that's
We were both teachers. We were both
Yes.
teachers at heart, and
Absolutely,
and
man.
had the kids' interest at
Yep.
heart. And I think playing games kept us in that tone.
Yeah.
We didn't have children of our own,
Uh-huh.
which was, within Sarah's family, all of her brothers and sisters had families, but she stayed, with me. I was her big kid,
Yeah. And then all your kids
and all the kids that we had. So we eventually made a family of our own.
Man, that is
Using the
so
store.
cool. That is so neat. That's neat. Gotta admit, after listening to that little section there, writing out the narrative for it, I started to record, and I could not even get through 2 words. Because in my narrative, I talked about how meaningful places like the Griffon are for our community. And in my narrative, I wrote about working with kids. Basically, literally half of my life, I've worked with kids. And I've worked with kids who have been a part of something like the Griffon, and it has literally changed their lives. And it has literally, God damn it, I'm tearing up again. And it has literally lifted them out of the trash that their parents have put them in. So Ken, Sarah, I thank you for helping South Bend, Mishawaka, our whole area, for helping our kids. And like you said, Ken, now those kids, their grandparents, they're bringing their grandbabies in to see you too. God, how special is that? So thank you, Ken, for joining me, and thank you for responding when a random guy just reached out pitching his idea for a podcast episode. And I totally thank you for taking a risk and coming on down to record your journey. And thank you to our listeners for once again listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. Join us in the next episode when I meet with Gary Sosnicki, the author of The Potato Masher Murder, a book about his great-grandmother's 1906 brutal murder that occurred right here in Mishawaka, Indiana, in a house that still stands on Marion Street. It's quite the tale, and Gary and I have a great time discussing his journey writing the book, but also we discuss the murder and the surrounding events. We will wrap it up here, but first, I have a few favors to ask. If you like the show, please be sure to share it with others that you think would appreciate it. Download or subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform you use. Please be sure to follow or like us on Twitter @RoundTheBendPod or on Facebook, Round the Bend Now and Then, or the original Twitter account that kind of sparked all of this, @RoundTheBend574. Lastly, please provide me with feedback. If you want to point something out that you appreciate, let me know. If there's something that you feel that I can improve upon, let me know. If you have any episode ideas or episode topics, or if you know of anybody who'd be willing to come on the show and share their journey or help tell a story from the past, let me know. You can email me at roundthebend574@gmail.com, or you can message me on Twitter or Facebook. Thank you again for listening as we learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.